Welcome to Marilyn Jordan's graduate thesis defense today. There's A Light Beyond These Woods, the early songwriting of Nanci Griffith. And I just want to make sure that everyone knows online here that we have her committee and her grad rep. So we have Professor Amy Kohlinger with us, Professor Jacob Hamlin with us in the committee, and our graduate representative, Tasha Gallardi. And my name is Dana Reason, and I have been fortunate enough to be working with Marilyn as part of her grad mentor team. Okay, welcome and take it away.
Thank you, Dana. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. I want to start by acknowledging that we're in Calapooya land because I'm very grateful to have lived my whole life on Calapooya land and grateful that I got to take a class from Dr. David Lewis about folks in Oregon. And also, I want to acknowledge and thank the folks who provided funding in the speech communication department and the Patricia Balian Research Center for Creative Arts, which has a very long name. And most of all, of course, to my lovely committee folks who helped me out. So now all I have to do is remember what it was I was going to say this morning. So my name is Marilyn Jordan. I'm here to present the information about my graduate research work and my thesis. When I started graduate school, I had 8 million questions. One of the biggest ongoing recurring questions was, how does music work? Why am I still so captivated by this? And as a songwriter, what are all these pieces and decisions that happen? And so one thing, of course, I didn't do was test that the slides would move forward. They did yesterday. So part of what I found is that part of the answer to that question that I found is that the songwriter makes lots of decisions. It's just decisions about all the details of the songs, the words and the keys and the phrasing and the rhythm and all those things. And then also makes decisions about how to deliver the songs to the audience. And then the other aspect is the perspective of the songwriter and the listener, and what happens when those come together to eliminate humanity, basically. So from that perspective, after going back and forth, I chose Nanci Griffith as a case study. I was already pretty familiar with Griffith's music mostly from the 90s and the late 80s, and had a lot of good reasons for looking at her. One is there's very little scholarly work, not only just on her, but also on the cohort of Austin songwriters that began with Townes Van Zandt, and also other artists in Americana. There's a little bit on a couple of key people like Loretta Lynn and Dolly Parton. And there is quite a bit on Townes Van Zandt, but that's it. There's the others all just get listed in a list. Also, Griffith was recognized by the Americana Music Association as a trailblazer in the genre of Americana, which has only existed since about 1998. And also in books about women in music in the 80s and 90s, Griffith was called the torchbearer for the artists who came after her, particularly people like the Indigo Girls and the Dixie Chicks, the then Dixie Chicks. I also chose her because she demonstrates roots of Americana and experiences of women in her time. And in my completely unscientific asking everybody I've talked to in the last 6 months if they've ever heard of Nanci Griffith, she's generally remembered by her contemporaries, people like me who heard her at the time, and songwriters, but has otherwise been largely forgotten because she's been out of the picture for so long. So in this work, I explore Griffith's career and the work that she did, and then focus in on her early years. I look at what decisions she made, in what contexts. I argue that her work reflects her experience and suggests her future work, and documents experiences of women in her time. And then potentially also provides a model for studying other Americana artists, or at least the beginnings of it. So today I'm going to talk about 3 areas. First, the research and artifacts that I found as part of the research, then the scope that I honed in on and the analysis that I did, and then the findings and relevance of that work. So For my process, I spent about 6 months, about 2 months each, first identifying and gathering sources, then trying to figure out what I had and how to understand them, and then analyzing the information and writing the specific part about her early thing. As part of that, early on, I just went online and looked at every, I can tell you every single detail about Nanci Griffith online now. I put a post on a Facebook page and immediately had somebody who said, I met her in 1974, I'll talk to you, which was amazing. And then I talked to him and it turns out his daughter was Nanci Griffith's goddaughter. So I interviewed a few people, and the goddaughter told me that Nanci Griffith's papers were in the Country Music Hall of Fame. And so in December, I traveled to Nashville and went to the archives there and looked through her materials. So then in the second stage, I reviewed really her career, and it was very much about sorting and trying to figure out what I had and the relationship with things and that sort of thing. And then focused in on her early pieces. So the artifacts that I used for the actual thesis were interviews with Griffith, quotes from her colleagues, the original interviews that I did, her papers from the archives, and 3 different kinds of recordings. Her first 2 albums, the studio albums, a set of 5 songs that sound like they were recorded on a cassette player that somebody got at her estate sale and offered to me, and some videos that one of her colleagues took at gatherings at his home in the late 70s. So for scope and analysis, so here's kind of the big picture of Griffith. So she was born in 1953 and died 3.5 years ago in 2019. Her most productive years, or the bulk of her career, was in 20-year period from 75 to 95. So between the ages of 22 and 42. Within that, she had 3 main periods. Each was about 4 albums each. So first she recorded on independent labels, and that was primarily folk music with a rockabilly influence. Then she moved to Nashville and signed with a major label, MCA, and focused on the country market. And then in the third phase, she switched to MCA's pop label and focused in that area. Then when she was 42, she got her first cancer diagnosis, her first of many health diagnoses that really shifted her career and her time. So she took that same model in the earlier time periods and used it with symphony, and upped her activism, was recognized by Gloria Steinem and the Veterans of America and Ann Richards. She did a lot of work for Governor Ann Richards in Texas, and then started being credited with awards also. But before all that, she started playing in Austin, where she grew up, when she was 14, and then touring regionally. And so she toured for about 10 years. And that's where she learned a lot of what she did. So my research scope then just looks at her early materials up until she was 30 or 20, until she was 29. So all before she was 30. So within that scope, I was looking at songs, which show up in all the other things. Her early poems and performances on the videos, and then her first 2 albums in that indie folk stage. So these are the primary artifacts that I had. So in the archives are printed poems and lyrics that are only available there. They're not published anywhere. And that was fascinating. The audio recordings that I talked about are in a private collection. The video recordings are also a private collection. And he started posting them like the week after I started my research, which was amazing and wonderful. So, and then the first 2 albums are called Light Beyond These Woods and Poet for My Window. And they're not available on streaming services like Spotify and things like that. So I had to really hunt them down. And eventually there's a guy named Grandpa Bob's Cracker Barrel or something who has both of those 2 albums up and was able to stream them on YouTube that way. So One of the questions I really had to get a handle on was how old was Griffith at the different times that these things happened, right? I didn't realize she was 42 when she first got diagnosed. So these materials fit into those age ranges. The first two materials, the oldest materials I had, she wrote in 1968 when she was 14. Her birthday is July, so all the year references are confusing because she was 14 for half of the year, she was 15 for half of the year. But the poetry and those materials, she really wrote, some of them I think she wrote like in classes in high school. At a point I was like, is she saying October all the time because she was taking poetry fall term, you know, that kind of thing. But during that time period, she was a student in Catholic school, and that Catholic imagery shows up in a lot of her stuff. Her parents were liberal beatniks and artists, and so she would have been very aware, and she lived in the South, so she would be very aware of the civil rights movement. One thing I read said that MLK's assassination really influenced her. She was 13 when that happened, and the Vietnam protests, which she also talked about later. She read voraciously, particularly influenced by Eudora Welty, who was a short story writer, and Carson McCullers, who wrote a lot about loneliness, and both of them were also independent women. And then she listened a lot to folk, Carolyn Hester, Odetta, and Woody Guthrie. The Buddy Holly and the Crickets were a big influence on her. She combined the folk and the Crickets rockabilly. And then from Loretta Lynn, she learned that it was possible for a woman to write her own songs. And that was an awakening for her. So the audio recordings is 5 songs. I don't know what year they are. It's a guess to me that it's the early 20s. It sounds rougher and like, you know, she hasn't quite figured out what she's doing yet. The video recordings were from 77 to 79. 2 of them are in the backyard. One of them's in a living room, recorded by Jim Gilmer. At that point, when she was in her mid-20s, she was touring regionally. Feminism was big and loud in her world, I think, in the 70s. She was part of the regional songwriter community that included Townes Van Zandt, Guy Clark, and Lyle Lovett, and Steve Earle, folks like that. Also Lucinda Williams, who was really the only other woman in her community. And then that was with the Houston's Anderson Fair restaurant and also the Kerrville Folk Festival. And then she also studied Mary McCaslin, who had a big influence on her. McCaslin wrote a lot about small towns and travel and played in open tunings. So that was a big influence. And so these last 3, of course, are all in the same kind of time period. But she released her first album when she was 24 and her second album when she was 28. So part of the reason I stopped there is the next 2 albums, like just there's so much, like you could write a whole book just on the next 2 years after that. So it was really interesting to me to look at how she, what she was doing before that happened. So I have 2 short examples of kind of how the analysis worked for me. Here's an example of something she wrote in 1969 and how it affected something that she did in 1991. The theme of it was don't try to hold me or I'll leave. So the 1969 would have been the written poetry in the archives, and the 1991 is a later album. And the first one is all these different versions of Don't Try to Tell Me You Love Me. These are just the first lines of a lot of her poems look like songs, so they look like they have verses. But don't try to tell me you love me, don't try to care, don't say you know me, don't try to understand me. And the later song is, it's too late to leave you, you know that I would never leave you. Too late to know you, you don't like to be known. You would never hold me, I don't like to be held. I'll always love you in spite of myself. So because I knew the later music, when I found the earlier things, I was like, wait, I've heard this before. So that's how a lot of that worked. And then the other example is a similar kind of thing, and just a little more complex. The theme is your boyfriend saying things to your friends, but it's different than what he's saying to you. And so in this case, on the left is my transcription of one of the songs on the cassette recording, and the one on the right is a print lyric that I found and said, wait, this is the same thing, with minor variations that I recognize as a songwriter, as how songs evolve as you're writing them, and then you start playing them and you're like, yeah, I actually want to say the word that in that space rhythmically or something like that. Or they become more precise, concise, those kinds of things. So, and then the later version is on an album in 1994, a song called Say It Isn't So. So I'm just going to read the first line of the Gonna Go Back recording. I've been hearing tales that you've been trying to spread around, knowing they're not true. And I've been seeing faces on your friends all over town, and they're crying for what I've done to you. And then in the 1994 song, the second line says, lately friends are warning me, what they hesitate to tell me leaves a thread of fear. People talk around this town, and I should have read the first part too, which is, are you saying just what you're saying just because you think that's what I want to hear, right? So it's the same idea, more sophisticated, concise, complex and developed writing later, but ideas that clearly she'd been working on for a long time. So what I found from that, I grouped the things that I found into two parts. So the first part is 3 pieces: sonics and musicality, learning her craft and learning her trade, which came from all of that regional touring and her weekly shows and that sort of thing. And then the third part is stagecraft and presentation. How is she deciding to present herself to the world? And then the second half is all about language. So poems, lyrics, and then specific words that she used a lot. So sonics and musicality, she clearly was influenced by folk and pop music. One of the comments she made was that everybody listened to the same radio in that time, so it wasn't segmented. You'd hear all these things together, right? So she heard the harmonies of the Everly Brothers, and she heard Carolyn Hester's folk music. Carolyn Hester was the first person to record Bob Dylan. He played on one of her albums. It's kind of interesting little side note. So anyway, so the vocals came from folk and pop, and then the guitar, from Mary McCaslin, she got her fingerstyle and open tunings, and from the Crickets, she got the rockabilly rhythms. Rhythm was a big deal for her, and she combined those folk and rockabilly in something that they called folkability at the time to describe what she was doing, but that's what the Americana Music Association recognized as her trailblazing. At the time, it meant nobody knew what to do with her, which I've decided is, for me, a sign that that's an interesting person. Nobody knew what to do with them because they were doing something different and new. So in terms of learning craft and trade, she spent 10 years touring and had the regular weekly shows. I can picture her at those shows observing the people in the bar. I mean, from the lyrics, it's like, oh, she was watching people do this, and there were neon lights, and she was on road trips. So you see a lot of that kind of journalistic observation that comes out of her writing, nurtured in the community that she was in. And also she had really savvy business skills. She would make things happen. And I think in one of the David Letterman interviews she does years later, she talks about products and markets. And I think what she was doing is she kept trying things and evaluating the results of what she did in a business-oriented sort of way. And she was very focused. And then she carried with her always this line that I have carried with me because I thought it was Nanci Griffith. And during this, I found out she was quoting Loretta Lynn. Your own voice is always the voice that gets you through life the best. And I just think that's great wisdom. And that's what I observed in what I saw that she did. And then the third part is the stagecraft and visual presentation. The bottom pictures are from her first 2 albums, Light Beyond This Woods and Poet My Window. And then the upper left is the inside. The other 3 are the videos, the Gilmer videos. The 2 on the right are outside. Sorry, they're not super clear, but they're what we've got. And the other one is the inside one where they weren't, the outside ones were like at a barbecue and they were playing shows and having a good time. And the inside one, they was more staged. I think he had maybe just gotten his camera and they were all kind of dressed up and standing in front of the fireplace. And so it was kind of interesting to think about what she was thinking as she was deciding to do that. So her mother worked in theater, and I think that certainly had an effect on her stage presence. She also, before she became a full-time musician, or in the middle of being a full-time musician and not, she got a degree in education and taught kindergarten and first grade for a couple of years. And in one of her quotes, she talks about how teaching, wrangling kids in kindergarten and wrangling listeners in a bar is basically the same idea. So I think that came into play, you know, during this time, she was figuring out how do you get people to pay attention to you and what do they respond to and that sort of thing. And then, another thing that she, that I didn't see as much of in this early work, but is a big part of her kind of if you had a short list of things you understand about, or that people understand about Nanci Griffith now, is the banter in between songs, the way she introduced songs. A couple of them are really famous. And I remember that, I remember leaving her shows and saying, I just love hearing the stories that she tells. And so I think part of what we're hearing there is the early writing she was doing led to songs and the banter, and it was all part of, which is part of why when I initially talked to you guys, I was thinking about looking at the banter also. So switching now to the language half of the findings. There were about 50 poems in the archive. That's a very general approximation. I didn't count them. And I focused here on just the two earliest ones, because what struck me is that that these are two themes, that the two pieces she saved are two themes that she used throughout her career. War is evil and we must stop it, which expands more to social justice. We gotta fix these things. It's songs of compassion is the way I describe that later. And then the second one are songs about relationship. He's wrong and he's hiding, and I'm going to prevail by owning being a touring musician and always returning to my home in Texas. Those were just kind of themes for her. And it also struck me about these that she certainly consciously chose to have those be the oldest two things that someone would find in her papers later. Because she was an intensely private person and did a lot of writing and rewriting and things like that. And so I think that certainly she chose that to be part of what she was doing. So this is probably the densest, this next part is probably the densest part I have to share here, because of course, songs are what it was all about, right? She's a songwriter. So, you know, sorting things into group is always problematic, right? But and there's things that go in both groups, but it really helps with the comprehension. And so I came up with these 6 categories: story songs, songs of compassion, road songs, love songs, which is like an endlessly huge category that every, you know, popular song is part of. And then expectation and reflection. Love songs as a category, I think goes from, ooh, he might like me, to, oh my God, what was I thinking, right? The whole spectrum, everything along the way. And then expectation and reflection in particular have to do with kind of a youthful perspective of what is life, you know, what's the narrative I've received? What's the life ahead gonna be for me? And for Griffith, born in 1953, women were supposed to grow up and be housewives, right? That was the narrative, that was the messaging. And then with feminism in the 70s, by the 80s and 90s, that had all changed, and people were trying to figure out what to do with that. And reflection, some of that is like from the 90s, looking back at what she thought was going to happen and going, this isn't really how I thought it was going to work out. And some of it is songs of loneliness and things like that in that category. So one way that I thought about it was to think about her influences. So Eudora Welty wrote short stories, Nanci Griffith wrote story songs with settings and characters and narrative arcs and things like that. Woody Guthrie and Odetta obviously were singing about social change. McCaslin and McMurtry were talking about road trips. Harlan Howard was still one of the most famous, or maybe not most famous, but like legendary, like people don't know about it, but he just wrote tons of national songs, maybe more than anybody else. And he and Griffith ended up being friends and writing an album together. Her narrative around expectation came largely from Carolyn Hester and Loretta Lynn, others also, of course, and then songs of reflection, Townes Van Zandt and Carson McCullers both talked about loneliness and agony and things like that. So, oops, oh, it switched. So I'm not going to go into detail with these, but some examples in the materials I was studying, the early albums, the poems and whatnot. These are some examples of those songs that I can go into more detail later if you want me to, but for instance, a love song, that's the one we were just looking at the example of. And then you see those same things in her later work. And these are some of the more well-known songs, especially those first 3-5 songs are some of the songs that got mentioned in her obituaries, for example. But it's the same idea. So just like there were 6 types of songs, there were 5 types of words. So as I was listening to her stuff, both at home before I went to Nashville and while I was sitting with her materials, I was like, oh, she uses the word April a lot, or why does she keep talking about pockets, like pockets full of nothing, and your love in my pocket, and there were all these things. I'm like, what is happening here? And so I was trying to kind of group them and go, okay, well, they're months and seasons, and they're all these angels and wings and flyers with wings and wheels and that sort of thing. So I grouped them into 5 categories to get a sense of them. And then I also found that there was kind of a spectrum, like one would kind of go into the other. So these are the 5 categories I put them in. The first one, and they're just names, titles. The first one is like everyday objects around a house, like mama and pans and pockets and books and shelves and things like that. April's and October's she used for beginnings and endings. She used mornings and evenings, also for like hope and difficulty. And then the Halos of Hearts is the Catholicism stuff. Texas and Travels is the road trips. Every touring musician has spent a lot of time on the road. There are lots of songs about roads and places. And then with the places, then you also get into some geography study and sense of place and one and stuff like that. And then Neon Waltzes, she's got songs about lights and dances, because she was playing in bars and driving home at night, and she's got traffic lights and seeing neon lights outside, and people are dancing in the bars, stuff like that. So, but as I was going, why does she keep talking about pockets? I realized, oh, I got rain and oak trees in my songs all over the place, right? It's from where she was, right? She was writing about what she could see in her world from her perspective. Which gets back to that early stuff that I talked about on the very first slide. So it sounds maybe really obvious, but to me it was a pretty big deal to go, oh, these were the words she had to say. They were the words she had available to say, and also the things she felt compelled to say. Maybe even kind of like me saying I'm grateful to live on California land, right? It's part of my life experience. She wouldn't say that, but she would talk about the Colorado River that ran through Austin, right? So, so I just have 2 examples of the words. The road trip ones are the simplest. So, in an early song, she starts the first verse with, it's a southern road west of New Orleans, and then when she gets to the start of the second verse, she says, Houston is just around the corner, but I think I'll stop off here. So in Lafayette, so you get this feeling that you're traveling, but she also uses it to convey a passing of time. And as well as, any connotations about the specific places. And then she does a similar thing. Oh, and then she's also like creating the setting for the story that she's telling. In '94, she did a similar thing that was less about the passage of time or motion and more about just setting or creating the setting for the conversation. And she actually did have a conversation with a guy at an airport. This is where this song came out of, but it was a flyer for the Air Force on a plane from San Antonio. He was traveling to London, going off to Buffalo, changing planes in Pittsburgh. So, so like I said, that's a simple example of using what she had in front of her. And then with the everyday objects, and this is a little hairier one to show, but I'm sharing my beautiful spreadsheet, which I probably should have changed the colors on before I finished my thesis, but basically in the spreadsheet, I captured the earlier phrase that reminded me of what I'd heard in the later phrase, and just noted if it was from early materials or later materials and where they were from. So in this case, the first one was from one of the really early poems. It didn't even have a title, it just started out when I was a girl. And then the later one was a song she recorded in '89. And in the first one, she says, one of these days, my mom is going to call saying, where did my daughter go? My baby's going to tell her she's packed her wings and down the road she's flown. And when I read that, I went, I know that saying. That's in this later line, this later song. Hey, then my mom is going to call and say where she's gone. He'll say down the road with the radio on. Much shorter, more concise, really effective in that song. That song, Listen to the Radio, is a beloved song that she played a lot. So it's interesting to me. It's interesting to see the development of that. And then the next two in this everyday object kind of thing is the idea of telephones and babies crying. And in both cases, she uses them as like alarming, like they're these alarming sounds. So for the telephone, the first one in an early place, she says the telephone rang, it jumped off the wall, right? It's just like it there for you. And a later one, she says, telephone's ringing in the middle of the night as I pull the bedclothes higher. Will it stop calling out if I turn on the light, like, go away? And then the baby cries, says, Mom is in the kitchen rattling pans and the baby cries. On the TV news, somebody died. The second one is the neighbors scream and their baby cries and I'm hiding in the corner. I won't be them, pray I won't be them one day. So those are just, those are examples of how I was mapping things. So why should we care? As I said early on, there were a couple of things that I felt needed to be addressed, that could be addressed through studying Nanci Griffith. One is that scholarly work on Americana songwriters, especially women and the Austin cohort. And even the things that mention the Austin cohort don't mention Nanci Griffith because she's not in recent memory. I really think of Nanci Griffith as being given to Emmylou Harris, but Emmylou Harris is still around, so people know who she is. And Emmylou Harris was squarely in country, as opposed to being in a genre that didn't exist yet. The work on Austin songwriters, as I said, was Townes Van Sant, Women in America, Loretta Lynn, Dolly Parton, and Emmylou Harris. It's interesting to me that all four of those people, if you say their first name, we know who you're talking about. Townes, Loretta, Dolly, and Emmylou. At least, maybe not in the general world, but within this music circle. And then potentially that it's a model for future research. There are some materials in the trade press. It took me a little while to kind of parse out what that means, but they're not generally scholarly works, and they're not about Nanci Griffith. There are some trade books that talk about women in Americana or something like that. They either don't list Griffith or it's really brief and she's in so many lists of Steve Earle, Townes Van Sant, Guy Clark, Lyle Lovett, Robert Earl Keen, Nanci Griffith, maybe Lucinda Williams. But in the, there's one book called Finding Her Voice from the late 80s and then updated later, that is by Mary Buthwick and Robert Orman, who talks about, who describe her as the torchbearer and spend a lot of time talking about her and her role and how she had really created this path for these other artists to walk through. And then the other relevance is this idea of Americana songs as artifacts. So in 2006, there was a master's student who did her work on the lyrics of Parton, Lynn, and Harris. And she argued that their songs were artifacts representing the experience of white working class women in the 60s and 70s. And so my work builds on her work. I believe that Nanci Griffith's work documents the experiences of postmodern women in the 80s and 90s. And these are just kind of two examples of that. She was navigating she and her audiences were navigating the next stage in the evolution of feminism, which of course has moved way past there now. It was a relative variable world instead of a concrete thing that preceded it, where women could do anything, but not really. So the narrative was women could do anything, but nobody had really figured out how that was going to work yet. And then her work reflected that because it was her experience navigating work, relationships, and sense of self. Those were kind of the three big pieces. And her audience were doing the same thing at the same time. So in conclusion, I've argued that Griffith's early work reflected her experiences and suggested her later work. Scholars can use her songs as documentation of postmodern white American working women, and that study of Americana artists possibly using this model is missing and important. So I'll wrap up with one of my favorite Nanci Griffith lyrics. It's just another morning here, and it's a miracle, and it comes around every day of the year. And the way I interpret that is it's just an ordinary, commonplace day like every other day, and it's a miraculous gift and a chance to do something